Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser, and for today's episode, I have on a very special guest. I have a writer, experimental musician, and cultural instigator, the one and only Erica Dawn Lyle. How are you? Welcome in.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure. I'm glad to finally have you on the podcast. I know when I had Robert Price and Prayer Ray from Kreamy Lectric Santa on, you came up in that episode, so I was very excited to be able to have you on because they did tell some stories about the early days
I
growing up
bet
in Miami and South Florida.
they were there in some of the earliest days. Yeah. I think Robert carried the tablets across the sea. Yes.
He definitely had some good stories for sure. And I know that you're going to have some great stories to share today as well, as we're going to really focus in on your Florida period. Of course, we'll get into some other things as well, because you've been pretty active for a very long time. And I think we can get started with kind of the early beginnings. Where'd you grow up?
Yeah, let's talk about Florida. I still, I still spend a couple months out of the year in Florida, so I feel like pretty connected to it. And despite everything, I love it quite a bit. Um, Despite the way things have been going there in the last couple of years, which is disturbing. But I grew up in Boca, just off Glades Road, a couple blocks from Florida Atlantic University, and got into punk in the late 80s. And I sometimes think about it was kind of a dark period to get interested in punk. I was talking to a friend of mine, this fellow Dan Yemen, who grew up in New Jersey in the late 80s and sang in a band called Lifetime that is still around. And Dan and I were comparing notes about our scenes. He had come up in the uh, Trenton scene around the kind of notorious City Gardens venue, which is like a famously violent place. And I felt like, when I came up in South Florida, also there was a lot of violence in the scene. There was definitely like a lot of tough guy stuff going on, and a lot of people. I saw a lot of people get like physically hurt really badly at shows, get stomped by skinheads and stuff like that. And so we were just talking about it and we were like, why did we stay involved? Like what was it about this thing that was so compelling that you like were terrified to go to the show and that you went and it was still so magical that somehow you like wanted to come back. In fact, you wanted to like make your own band, you wanted to make your own magazine, etc. Um, and so like there was a little bit of that vibe in late 80s South Florida punk. Down the street from me was a kid named Buddha, who is also still involved in punk rock and was my best friend for a while. We went to our first show together on Halloween of 1987. Um, and Buddha and I were like, coming up and like kind of had the dream of like, we want to make a band, we want to have a fanzine, we want to run a label, we want to run a venue, we like want to do all the things. Like and yet we like didn't know anyone. There's like, we couldn't find other punks. And you would like go to the Peaches record store in Boca and you would go to the like indie section, which is where they kept the handful of like records that had enough distribution to make it into a chain record store. And you would see like all of the shitty second and third records by legendary punk bands that had just come out. Like it'd be like MDC's speed metal record, and like Bad Brains is like weird kind of like homophobic funk quasi metal record or whatever. And you'd be like, what you'd know that these were the bands that you wanted to hear, but you couldn't, you had to find an older punk to get a copy of the real record, and we couldn't find older punks. Um, and then like Black Flag had broken up in like 1986, but we were like in 1987 and we were like, it's oh, did we miss it? Like all the bands of Descendants, we're like looking at the tapes, it's like Descendants 1985. Everybody's last record was like 2 years ago, and every
Right.
record now is like a speed metal crossover record or whatever. So it felt pretty dark, but we would try to figure out what we could do. when I started high school is when I kind of got brought into the scene a little bit. In my second hour class, there was a fellow named Toad, um, who I'm sure had broken his dear Jewish grandmother's heart by growing his hair into his eyes and changing his name from Daron to Toad. Um, and Toad was the singer in a speed metal band that was operating in our high school called Fatal Sin. And Toad gave me the name Iggy. Toad took a liking to me because I was like kind of like a little buddy, you know? And surprisingly, he had kind of a supportive relationship with me. He brought me like tapes and stuff and was like, "You should check this out." Instead of being super condescending, he actually was like trying very hard to bring me into the scene. And I was but he was into speed metal, you know, which is kind of, you know, so I had been into Black Sabbath and had been into like Slayer. Black Sabbath's affect made a lot of sense to a kid from who suffered the like soul crushing Sunday afternoons of a South Florida street, you know. Um, but like, and the intensity of Slayer was like really important to me, and how evil it was. You know, it just felt like this was like you were going to get in trouble for owning this record, you know, which felt like really important.
What
And
was it about those like early metal records for you, like the Sabbath, the Slayer, and others that you think called out to you?
well, I just think that Slayer, like, I was like pushing like a real intensity, you know, like looking back now, I see that, you know, that the guitar solos have this really insane kind of like free jazz vibe almost. It's like they were really inventing this kind of sound. Um, but then they also like kind of push the limits lyrically to like in a way to like what was like permissible to discuss, right? It was sort of like deadpan list of atrocity, you know, like a kind of like a singer simply listing all of the bad things that could happen to the human form,
Right.
right? But also the imagery, all of it, you were like, ooh, you know, like you know, like I'm gonna get like arrested if I have this, you know, it's like kind of what it felt like. And this is at a time when like, you know, the Two Life Crew was in facing obscenity trials and stuff like that, you know. So it was like that was the cultural climate of the Reagan time was it was very like revanchist kind of like Christian conservative culture, you know. Not that we've ever seen that again, but and so I was excited about that, but that's the kind of music that Toad was pushing towards me, and I couldn't quite feel it, honestly. You know, he was giving me tapes of like bands like Creator and Voivod, and I was like, you know, like metal was kind of like also felt like cheesy to me. Like I couldn't quite relate, but I related to the undergroundness of it. I was like, these records feel like, you know, like they like there's only two of them in existence or something. Like, how do people know about this? You know, it was like that was attractive to me, but the music itself, I was like, the evil part of it is like, I don't know, it didn't have the like finesse of Slayer, you know, or whatever. And so through that, I was searching and I found punk. And I remember there was a day when I got like a Circle Jerks, a DRI, and a Sex Pistols tape all at once at the mall. And it was like kind of like launched me. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. This music is fast, but it also has like a little bit of a different kind of message to it, which made more sense to me at the time. But
That's a pretty good starter kit.
it was like a historic day for me. I was like,
Yeah.
I don't know where I got like the $20 to get the tapes, but like that was the time, you know, and I got all those tapes at once and I was like, okay, cool, I'm there. But so Boot and I, we were like looking for like other punks, and there were some older punks in Boca area. There were these boys who had been in a band called Faster Poison, this guy Gary Costa. Um and the older punks, the delineation of the older punk was like these guys were like probably like 24 when we were like no, okay, wait, they wouldn't have been that old. They would have been like 21 or 22 when we were like 14 or 15. um they had seen Black Flag at Fireman's Hall. That was like the line, you know. It was like like you know, which to us was like like Black Flag was in South Florida and you saw them like in person in the same room. That's insane. You know, we would go to like Open Book and Records and North Miami Beach and we would see the Black Flag set list on the wall and we'd be like, that really happened, that's insane. Um, just like the gap in like just a couple of years. I mean, here we are, 30 something years later talking about it. And back then it was like, it was all 2 years before, and it was even more mysterious, right, than it is now. Um, and so, but these older punks sucked. They were like, they treated us like shit. They basically only hung out with us because Buddha was already like a guitar wizard when he was 15, and they needed people to fill out the lineups of their like kind of crappy bands that they would cobble together. I know I'm talking mad shit, but it's just how it was. And we would hang out at the Boca Raton jetty and like just like whatever, just like steal, like run out of like 7-Eleven with 12 packs and go sit at the jetty, and then the cops would come, and then we would have to go home. It's how it was.
Were there any actual shows happening in the Boca area at that time?
Well, what happened for me, the first show was so Toad was like, hey, check it out. My band's playing this Halloween party. And so I went to see Fatal Sin on Halloween at 87. And the rhythm guitar player they had at the time was this older fellow, Greg, who had already been in the military and gotten out. His father ran a a fishing lure manufacturing factory that was on the railroad tracks in Boca Raton, and called Cisco Kid Bait and Tackle. And that's where the show was. They practiced in the bait and tackle lure making factory after hours, and it smelled like acetone, which is from the paint. And the opening band was the first punk band I saw, which was a band called Crypto, that featured this really wild, amazing drummer named Tim. Tim Beer Crypto was the name that he often went by. He was a little older and was a kind of a crazy, rad drummer. And then they had this guy, Doug the Slug, on bass. And I don't remember much about Crypto except for that they had a song. They were from Coral Springs, and they had a song called Coral Springs Sucks. So they were like, they were like, hey, they weren't wrong, right? And then
I
they,
grew up in Coral Springs too.
no way. Oh my God. Okay, so
Yeah.
just around the corner. Um, and they had did you know these guys? Maybe.
No, I didn't know them. I think when I was growing up in Coral Springs, the main band at that time was Ambugalard. They were like the Coral Springs hometown
Oh,
band. But yeah,
yeah.
I must have missed Crypto. They must have come before I got into
They're
into
probably a little more, yeah, because they were like older punks. I sort of remember the name and Boogalard. Um, they So yeah, Crypto played that show. Fat Lady on the Beach, that was one of their other songs. That was the kind of band they were. Um, and so that was like the only show I had ever seen in Boca. There there were like sporadic shows around. There was like one time we went to the Def Club, which I think was in Pompano on Sample Road. Which was interesting. At I wonder if, okay, because in San Francisco there had been a famous punk club, which I did not know about at the time, called the Deaf Club, at 16th and Valencia, which really was a community center for deaf people that hosted punk rock shows with all these great bands like the Dead Kennedys and stuff in the late 70s and early 80s. Um, because the deaf people would not object to the aesthetic qualities of punk rock music, and they enjoyed the pounding of the beat. And so there was a symbiosis there. Somebody figured out to do the same thing in Pompano at some kind of community center for deaf people. And there were some shows there for a minute. I'm not sure who was setting them up, but I do remember going to a show there. I remember we were drinking in the parking lot, and a deaf person came up to us and just pointed their flashlight at the beer and at us, and then at the beer until we're like stopped. But so that was kind of it. There wasn't a lot. We were trying to like get into shows. We were trying to get into bands. we started a band that we had different names for that practiced in the garage of this kid named Breekus, who was Buddha's really close friend. And we tried to get in the battle of the bands at the high school. And that was kind of like that was a little bit of a lark or kind of just like a fuck off experiment because like the music that we were interested in was so culturally like reprehensible pre like Nirvana. Like there was no place in the world for punk rock or indie culture in the larger world. It was like if you were a punk, you would li- did anyone ever do this to you? Okay, I've talked about this with people all over the country, and this has happened to them, where they would be a punk, and people would come up to them and be like, "Oh, you're one of those punk rockers," and then they would go, "Fuck your mother, kill your brother." And they would start like miming. They would make this song, like the punk song. It's the same song. Other people have had this happen to them, where someone goes, "Fuck your mother, kill your brother." Like that's the song. So like
I've seen that happen more on the metal side than I have on the punk side.
right. Well, see, there's more understanding now of punk. People know that punk is about politics and it's about community. But metal's also about community. Anyway, the so yeah, so we were like that. So we were like, we weren't even a good band. We were barely a band. It wasn't like we thought we could get in the battle of the bands. It was just like we're like, let's go fuck with this thing. Probably a bunch of square kids are doing this thing. So we went to the high our band was our band was actually called Anal Pour, Pour, which is like I guess like a diarrhea reference.
Whose
Uh,
idea was that? You remember?
Probably me because I come up with all the worst band names. Like there's not a single good one that I've had. It's like well, Ye Old Buttfuck was pretty good, but mostly they suck.
I
Um,
mean, they're original.
right. So anal pour. We show up at the thing and we have to fill out a form to enter, and it's like your band name, and then we're like, shit, if we say anal pour, they're not even gonna let us go out there. So we put AP. And then this like old granny, this like sweet lady who's like working the table, she's like, "What's AP stand for?" And like on the fly, I'm like, "Oh, it's Aaron Price." That was our old bass player. We didn't have a bass player, like in the band. It was just guitar, drums, and me singing. I was the front person. It was Aaron Price. We named the band after him because he passed away last year. He, was in a car accident. And she was like, "Oh, bless your heart." Like, that's so sweet to remember your friends like that. What a great group of kids you are. And we're like, "Thank you."
You really turned that around real
So
well.
we're like, you know, and so we get up to do our thing, and we had like three songs, and like one was actually like an anti-Bob Hope song called No Hope. So we were like right in the vein. We were like, it sounds like I'm making fun of crypto, but really I'm making fun of myself, right? Um, because we were like the same deal. And so but the first song we played was called Dude, You're a Fucking Dick, was the name of the song. And we called it DYAFD. And it starts off with this like crunchy mosh part, dun, 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 dun. And we start playing it, and they stop. They're like, wait, they stop us. They're like, you have to tell us what all the songs are called before you play them. Like introduce the song, and then and I was like, DYFD, and they're like, what's it stand for? And I was like, dude, you're fucking dick. And then we played the song. And so, I was doing some kind of like, in some ways, my singer act prefigured the Chuck Loose and Chickenhead guy like dove on the table of the judges and was like rolling around and stuff like that. Um, and it was a lot of fun for us. The winners of the Battle of the Bands that day were actually this band called the Vacant Andes, who had a more kind of cleaner, kind of like Descendancy, kind of like poppier vibe. And I had to admit that they were pretty good. I was like, damn, like we're actually a shitty band. These guys are like a real band and they won the thing. um, and then I think the Vacant Andes dude became the Dashboard Confessional guy, right? That's what
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
I think originally it was someone else on vocals. I think Chris came a little bit
Uh-huh.
after. But yes, he did go
Yeah,
by
interesting.
Dashboard.
Yeah, so that's funny. And then they got to play like the concert at the high school with this band Toy Soldier, who were these kind of like hair metal guys that were in the scene. There was a had been a there's kind of a split between hair metal was super popular at the time, like Poison, Cinderella, stuff like that. And then there were the speed metal kids thought that the at my high school thought that the hair metal people were posers. But there was this hair metal guy named Mark Burton who was really sweet, who also was the bass player of Fatal Sin. So they're like, well, Mark's cool. Um, and there was a little crossover there with the hair metal guys and the super dirtbaggy guys. Um, but Toy Soldier was like a little bit older, and like they were like the hair metal guys who then became Saigon Kick, like a couple years later when so that was the thing. We were in this scene where we were like playing this reprehensible music that was not allowed to exist. Like you could not play a show in public. You could not exist as a punk, pretty much. And so we were always felt we were kind of like in this cultural war with these people because we're like, look at these guys, man. They're in this hair metal band when that's popular. And then a year later, Jane's Addiction comes along and they're like, okay, now we're gonna do this thing, we're gonna become like, and the guy from Saigon Kick told one of us, like, yeah, like we're really into the sex death imagery now or something. And we just thought it was so preposterous. Of course they did really well for themselves too.
Did you see Saigon Kick in the early days at all?
No, we didn't go see stuff like that. But so yeah, so we were just like that was kind of like what the Boca world Boca world was like. It was like not a great situation. We kept trying to do that band. There was another guy, there was the thing where you would try to answer ads because like there were so few people. It's like if you saw a punk at the mall like 300 yards across the parking lot, if you saw like a flash of blue hair, you would like start running to like find that person. You'd be like, who are you? Is what it felt like in Boca, like and also I think some of that is about the spatial realities of Florida, right? Because it's like you think of like punk rock is coming in these urban kind of like New York or London kind of situations, but then where people are like in thick, proximity on the streets. But in South Florida, everyone's tucked away in their home, they're in a car on the freeway. So there wasn't a lot of punk visibility. And then plus, like, let's be real, like to really go all the way and dress like a punk in South Florida, heat and humidity, to be like leather jacket, you got your spikes, you're doing the whole thing, is like, is a real commitment. That's like
Very real in that heat,
that is
especially
like
if you were doing it now. It's even 100 times worse.
exactly like to face the Mad Max future like that. So it's like, yeah, that's why it's a subterranean air conditioned life, right? Um,
What was your style like back then?
I was just kind of like a scraggly long-haired dirtbag, and I kind of like adhered to that for a lot of years. It didn't feel so out of place. I think for the reasons I mentioned, like later on, like in the 90s, there was a time where me and Buddha did an interview for Scam, my magazine, with Mike O'Brien, who had been in the Eat, who we had become friends with. And I was struck by I noticed that we were all kind of had the same uniform of like a t-shirt, cut off shorts, and like Converse. And then it's like, yeah, it's just like kind of that's more like what the Florida punk kids looked like that I knew that when we were doing bands, everybody was like just kind of casual and like grubby, but not so super punked out. Um, I think I used a photo of me and Mike and Buddha's like bottom halves as like the illustration to show this like through line from the from the Eat to like today. Um, but yeah, we went down to yeah, we kept playing, whatever. We like never really got our shit together in Boca. We had a band with this, we answered an ad. There was an ad open that was like this kid was like, I'm into the Descendants and All and the Chemical People. It was like all the kind of popular bands. And his name was Milo and he was in Boca. So we called him up. It turned out his real name was Adam, but he just wrote Milo on the thing, like Milo from the Descendants. And And so we were like, oh, we got a new person, you know? So we started trying to do a band with him on bass, and that happened for a little while. But then one day we were driving to practice and we got rear-ended by somebody and it destroyed his car. And then we just couldn't get to practice anymore. It was the end of it. He ended up moving away to Oakland and was in a band called Indian Summer for a while. It became kind of a popular 90s emo band. I think
Yeah.
I don't know what him, he had a twin brother named Seth. I have no idea what those guys are doing these days, or I haven't seen them in like 30 years or so. But I did see him in Oakland one of the first times I went out there because he was living in this when I first went to Oakland, I stayed at this psychotic warehouse at 1647th Street in West Oakland that was like where the Green Day song "Welcome to Paradise." They wrote about that place. They were living there, and it was like Green Day and Jeff Ott from Crimpshrine um and Milo. You know, it was like, and like 42 other punks were living in this like rat infested hovel with this like landlord that like would like front you acid. So it was like the landlord was like the drug dealer and everybody was like super strung out on meth and like taking acid. So Adam was not though. Adam was still, I think, straight edge. Um anyway, I had a shitty family life. You know, my mother married a super violent and fucked up person, and it was an abusive situation. And it eventually, you know, I used to spend a lot of time as a teenage runaway, and some of that was in Boca. There was you know, I remember there were like, yeah, you just go like sleep in abandoned vans or sleep on the beach or whatever like that, stuff like that. And yeah, I remember like going to the Cameo one time to see Circle Jerks with Buddha. I got a ride down there while I was like kind of just like living in some abandoned van or something, and Buddha, we were talking to Greg from Circle Jerks, and then Buddha was like basically panhandled him. It was kind of like you should give Iggy some money living in this abandoned van, you know. Greg just sort of like ran away, you know. But I ended up getting kicked out of my house by my mother when I was 17 on Labor Day weekend of 1990. And so a couple of things happened then. First, I went up to Buddha's for a couple of days. He had moved to Boynton with his mother, and we spent a couple of days writing songs. He had a 4-track and a drum machine. And I had been playing bass at that point. I was a bass player because I was really obsessed with Mike Watt and the Minutemen and with Kira's bass playing and the Black Flag instrumental stuff, and I was like really into bass. And so I had a bass and was playing, and me and Buddha were like getting closer to the idea of doing a band. He had like a little drum set. He was going to play drums. And we recorded some stuff, but we needed to put guitar down, and he was like, you have to play the guitar for some reason. And I had never done it before. And he was like, no, it's really chill. Just do this, do this, do this. Here's how you do a lead. Here's how you bend the strings or whatever, because he knew how to do everything really well. And so that was kind of the first time I played guitar, really, was when we recorded this early demo with songs that ended up being Chickenhead songs, like Smash and Grab and some other songs. Um, so I did that for a minute, and then I ended up kind of living on the beach in Boca, and then I was just trying to figure out, like I went to like it was a different Circle Jerks gig. I think it was when they played, maybe it was, oh, it was with it might have been that gig with the Weirdos. I went to like the Weirdos that got back together and did like a 1990 tour with Circle Jerks. I went to that show, and I think that I had known about Chuck Loose, maybe, or we had talked on the phone. Maybe he had had an ad up or something, but like I hung out with him there, and I was like explaining my situation that I was like pretty homeless, and he was moving out of an apartment in Fort Lauderdale and had just cleaned all his stuff out, and like there was like 2 weeks left on the rent, but he was already in his other place. So he's like, well, I'll just give you the keys to that place if you want. So that's how I like moved to Fort Lauderdale. I just like lived in this empty apartment for a while and was like stealing my food and like just kind of like trying to figure out what to do. Um, I was like a kid, I was like a little bit in a state of shock. Like I was a writer, at that time I like wrote all day and I was like kind of like it's gonna be fine, but I was obviously like if you pull back the lens, it was like here is a young person in trouble who has no idea what's about to
Right.
happen.
What did
Uh,
your mother think of the fact that you were out? Like, did she ever follow up to see how you were
She
doing at
kicked
that
me
point?
out. I
Yeah.
mean, like not without getting too deeply into it. There had been my stepfather had tried to kill me, and there had been like a restraining order against him. And then she, when that time was up, she let him come back into the house, and she told me that I had to go for my own safety. It's a fucked up situation. Um, but and so it was her choice basically that I leave, so yeah, that was what was going on. But the thing was I was trying to find a lifeline of like punk, and there was this new punk house that Chuck had, and out by off of Broward Boulevard, out by the sheriff's station out there, and close to 95. And I was like, it's when that time was up in the other apartment, I was like, I gotta figure out how to like live in Chuck's house, because I don't know that many people. These people are punks. They're trying to do stuff. I gotta make this happen. So I kind of just started squatting Chuck's house, basically, and with this other deadbeat named Ron Varndell, who was this like spiky punk from the Bay Area that had come out to South Florida for some mysterious reason and ended up on Chuck's couch. And Chuck hated Ron Varndell, and then he hated me. Like he was just like he would go to work, he would come home and be like, "What's up with you fuckheads?" Like, and we would like break into his room and like find money in his drawer and go and like buy beer and stuff.
Besides Chuck being like a punk, like what was it? What else was it about him that you
I'm
feel
punk.
like kind of led you to
I'm punk. He
want?
had a job. He's no punk. He's like
Well,
the man.
what was he doing back then for work? Do you remember?
He wasn't selling drugs or anything that a punk should do. He was he worked at I think he was the fry cook at the chemist shop on Las Olas. It was like a drugstore that had a lunch counter. Um so Chuck yeah, so that was kind of like I got into this house and like people called it the Fort Lauderdale Punk House. So then I felt like I had some identity for a minute. I was like, cool. And then I started working on like my fanzine, and I tried to get Buddha to move down there, and he sort of did, but sort of didn't. And and then that's when it felt like things started happening a little bit more for my involvement in punk. Let's see, I don't know. I mean, to backtrack a little, it's like I had already been going to the Cameo. You had asked about venues, and I realized that this should be about more than just me. But like like as I said, I couldn't. There weren't really a lot of spots otherwise. There were like a lot of like corporate kind of places. Bands would play like at the Button South on the beach, or Summers on the Beach was a place. Like big bands, like only like larger bands would come reliably to South Florida like every year. Like the Circle Jerks came all the time, 7 Seconds came all the time. Um, but I remember when Danzig came on his first tour in like 87 or 88, like me and a friend actually took the Greyhound from Boca, from the old Boca Mall, and just went to Miami Beach and went to the Cameo and asked everyone we could, is anyone going to drive back to Boca tonight, until we found a ride. We didn't have a plan. We were just like, we have to see some punk culture, even though, Danzig was not exactly a punk culture at that point. Um, but so yeah, it was kind of like that. I wasn't able to make it to a lot of those spots. And there weren't like other kids that much in Boca that were driving down there, or you could get a ride with these kind of shittier older punks like sometimes. There was a girl named Punk Rock Paula who was like probably like 24, and I had some massive crush on her. She had been in like DC punk scene and like lived in South Florida. And I worked in the mall for a while. Even as a teenage runaway, I'd be like homeless, like working in the mall, and I would like stare across at the deli. Baines Deli was the restaurant where Punk Rock
Was
Paula.
this the town center mall?
Yeah. Yeah, I would like be like punk rock Paula. And when she took me to the Circle Jerks gig, I was like, I can't believe I got a ride with punk rock Paula. She was very sweet. But, you know, she was like 10 years older than me. And she was like, there you go, little buddy. Um, enjoy the show. But so that was the scene, was just trying to get rides. But the Cameo, like the first time I went to the Cameo was like kind of right around the time I met Toad, and way back in the beginning of high school. I went with this guy who was a senior who I think had also somehow already been in the military, like, or was like about to join. And I remember I went to see Anthrax and Exodus, and we stopped at like right before we got to the Cameo. He's like, I gotta go to McDonald's. And I was like, okay, sure. And then he got like 3 Big Macs, and he was like, I gotta load up on these carbs because I'm gonna mosh all night. And I was like, wow, sick, you know? And then it was like my first pit, and I got like so into it. I couldn't believe how awesome it was. And I was like covered from head to toe and just like bruises, you know. And I went to school on Monday morning, and Toad was like, yo, Iggy, it's sick. You know, like, whoa, you're cool, you know. And Yeah, actually, my friend Greta Snyder, the filmmaker, years later when I was living in San Francisco, it turned out that she had made Exodus's videos for them because as a pay, you know, she just got paid to make videos for them because they were like in the, you know, scene in the Bay Area. But um, so yeah, anyway, the Cameo, that was that. The Cameo was really fascinating. Maybe that's why, to answer Dan Yemen's question, maybe that's why I kept coming back, is because there was something to me that was really fascinating about the Cameo. The Cameo was like a lost republic. You know, you would come into this place and there were hundreds and hundreds of of outside people. You know, there were punks, there were skinheads, there were metalheads, there were like all these subcultures. And the building was so beautifully decrepit, you know, and like people would be passed out up in the, you know, it had been a theater. So, you know, people would be passed out up in the theater seats and or making out or doing drugs. And then the area for the mosh pit was enormous. And um there was something so grand about it, you know, and I think a lot of that period in the early 90s when things started to become renovated and gentrified, there was that feeling across the country for people when they discovered these old post-war places that had this kind of like architectural grandeur that had become decrepit in this kind of compelling, attractive way, you know. So there was something about like, who are all these people? Because they were not in Boca. You couldn't see them on the street anywhere, but somehow
Right.
they would materialize inside of the Cameo. Um, and what was even more mysterious was that this is like 87, 88 for me, 89. But I feel like by like 91, all those people had disappeared. And that was even crazier, was that we were like, just a couple of years ago, you'd go to see like DRI, and there'd be like hundreds and hundreds of people. And then all of a sudden you're like, where did those people go? So that was always a mystery to me too. I never exactly understood. Um,
Were you discovering a lot of local bands in this period too that maybe had opened, or perhaps just as you were going more down south to Miami, you were learning about some bands that were from down there?
no, I still didn't really know a lot of local bands. That came kind of more, so it's like, yeah, I got to Fort Lauderdale, and then, you know, things started happening a little bit more. Like I remember going to Churchill's, I think for a Halloween 1990 gig, and that's where I met, yeah, the Prom Sluts were playing, and I sort of met Robert and Priya, like just a little bit that night. And that's kind of the time that I was meeting my best friend Ivy, who we did a lot of projects together over the years, and who's, you know, like the most prominent character in the early Scam magazines, probably. My partner in crime, Ivy. She was like at the time was like her best friend was this girl, Michelle, and they were both like 15. Ivy had like blonde hair and Michelle had black hair, and they like hitchhiked around Miami, like getting skeezy older men to like buy them drugs and help them do crimes and stuff, you know. They were like super feral. And I me and Ron Varndell, the spiky punk, went down to this house party in Kendall when we were living in Fort Lauderdale, and immediately got like surrounded by skinheads. And Ron had a nose ring, and the skinheads was like, "What's up with you faggots? What the fuck are you doing here?" You know, and Ron, they were like, "Where are you from, faggot?" And Ron was like, "San Francisco." And this guy who like later, like this guy from these some of these guys are from West Palm Beach, and there was this one guy who was like who like totally like went to prison later for like killing. And it was, like, these are guys who like ended up in prison. It was like they were bad news people. He reached out and grabbed Ron's nose ring and just ripped it out of his nose, and Ron's face started to bleed. And then Ivy like jumped up and was like, it was actually her birthday in 1990. And she jumped up and was like, "It's my birthday." And she jumped in front of the skinhead, and it was just like young blonde girl. It was like, "Hey, don't you want to say happy birthday to me?" And then she's like, "You guys got to get out of here, go go go." And we just like took off and like left. And then like I saw, you know, I never, you know, saw her again like months later and was like, "Thanks for that," you know, or whatever. That's how we became friends. um but that's when we started getting into, yeah, when I was in Fort Lauderdale, it was like we were trying to do stuff in Fort Lauderdale. Like we had see, okay, so I had mentioned that like we had had this, me and Buddha had the feeling that punk was over. But then there was this magical day in like 89, I think, where we went to Peaches, and for the first time they were carrying Maximum Rock and Roll. The first time they ever had it. And they and then they also had the Op Ivy record on tape. And so I bought the Op Ivy tape and Buddha bought the Maximum Rock and Roll. And all of a sudden we're like connected to all these punks. All, you know, we're like, shit, man, it's like still happening. There's like punks everywhere. We're like started writing to people, you know, like trying to make friends with people, ordering tapes, ordering other magazines, seeing that there was a context where we could exist, because it felt kind of hopeless otherwise. And so we started kind of doing that in Fort Lauderdale, and Chuck was very much interested in that too. He was like he had started booking shows. So right when I moved in with him, he was like booking, he had booked some bands from the Bay Area, who were on very small records. I think he did a show for a band called 23 More Minutes that came through, and he did it at the Junkyard. And so we were sort of faced with this problem of like we want to like start doing stuff inside of this local scene that feels really violent and sort of retro and not super imaginative, you know? And we're like in touch with this like national scene. Um, like at that time, I remember like I ordered some 7 inches from Lookout Records in the Bay Area, and I was like, "Hey, like we're in Miami booking shows, like send some people our way." And who whoever wrote back, it was probably Chris Applegren or Pat Hines, from the label. You know, a couple years later, I ended up in the Bay, and I was always like sleeping on Pat's couch, and I ended up getting like a drawing of me was like in the Lookout catalog. But at that time, I was like just in Florida. And they sent us back a list of people, and it was like, "Oh, here's, you know, Billy Joe from Green Day. Here's his phone number. Robert Eggplant from Blatz. Here's his phone number." It was just like call these people up. So we just started like we had all these like phone call scams. Like we were like figuring out how to like use stolen calling cards all the time and stuff. So we just started calling all these people and just spending hours on the phone with like punk kids all over the country and be like, "Hey, we're in South Florida. We're like cool. You should come here." And just like shooting the shit. And some people would come. Most people were like,
Did they
like,
not want to come because also it was such a far trip to go that far south down to Fort Lauderdale or Miami?
yeah, I think, I mean, that was it, as you probably know. Yeah, it's like people would go to Gainesville or they would go to Pensacola, but yeah, once you come into Miami, you got to come back up. So, and there was a bad rap there. So like by 1991, we're booking lots of shows. Like 1991, all of a sudden was kind of like, I feel like 1991 was kind of the year where a lot changed, where like, um, all of a sudden there like that, like the Gilman kind of scene in the Bay Area and the ABC No Rio scene in New York were these kind of like beacons nationally of like um punks could control a venue, and so like everybody was trying to start their own venue. There was a lot of like inspiration, um and there was kind of a new wave of like bands that were like playing punk and hardcore music instead of metal that were coming up like out of the Bay, or like Born Against and their scene in New York were like playing like kind of a more classic, updated kind of classic hardcore sound, with like political lyrics and with a really commitment to DIY values. And so those people were coming through. We were booking some shows for people from the Bay Area. I remember Born Against came through with a band called Rorschach from Jersey. And yeah, see, that was a classic thing. So it's like Born Against and Rorschach come through. Rorschach got mugged in Tampa and lost like hundreds of dollars. And then Born Against came and played at Washington Square and Miami Beach, and there was a skinhead fight while they were playing, and people were like yelling threats at Sam McPheeters, the singer. And I interviewed Sam for Scam after the gig, and he was like really friends with me and Chuck, and was like, but it was clear that they were never gonna come back, they're just like, yeah, this sucks. This trip to Florida almost ruined our tour, like, so like that's kind of what the vibe was. We did a lot of shows in 91. But by that time, the Fort Lauderdale Punk House was kind of like 1990 into 91. That's where I wrote most of the first Scam. We got really into like not just like stealing, but sort of making it like an ethos, like trying to like sort of spin like a countercultural political manifesto out of just like shoplifting, Um, and there was this older fellow named John Dania, who we called him that because he lived in Dania, and he was 24, I was 18, that kind of age difference, who taught us how to dumpster dive. And we were like, well, shit, man, everything's free. We got this. So we made a magazine. I was making a magazine about that. Chuck was doing a magazine called Get Loose. And so us doing the magazines, and Chuck's magazine was very influential. Chuck was a very influential figure in that scene. He was a couple years older than us. He had been around a little bit more. He knew about a little bit more older stuff than we did. Um, and he had a certain confidence about what he was doing that we all rallied around. And he was able to get things done. He was like, whereas like I was this kind of like criminal scumbag, like Chuck actually participated in like paying the bills and stuff, like things that sort of like sustained like living,
Right. Exactly.
um yeah.
Were you aware of any other zines down in Florida at that time that were already in existence or maybe came before that you were reading?
No, everything was mythical. You know what I'm saying? You would hear about stuff. You'd be like, oh, there had been this magazine called Tropical Depression, but like, where could I get a copy? It's like you would hear these rumors about stuff. It was only later that I would find some of that stuff and see how cool it was. But but it was like, and also some of that thing, yeah, it's like we were definitely like trying to find traces of punks that had been there before. We were obsessed. I remember when we were living in Fort Lauderdale, Maximum Rock and Roll used to have a record collector column called Welcome to the Scum Pit. And the boy who did it, Eric, you wrote a piece about the Eat, God Punishes the Eat 7-inch. And he talked about, this Lost Classic 7-inch from Florida. And he talked to Mike Watt in the piece. And Mike Watt was like, yeah, it's one of my favorite records, And we were just like, fuck, like, where's the Eat? Like, this is 1990, the Eat were just around, but like we couldn't really find them. And then magically, Chuck found a copy of God Punishes the Eat at All Book and Records in Fort Lauderdale, which was this record store that used to be over by the Sears on Sunrise. And And so we had the record, and it added, it's such a great record, but it really added to the mystery too, because we were like, so there's an address on it, 2600 Trapp Avenue, Miami, Florida. And it's like, so that I would like go walk by there. And it's just a little house in Coconut Grove, you know? So you're thinking of like the Ramones in front of a brick wall or something, you know? Or like John and Exene on Hollywood Boulevard, you know? But like this is like where South Florida punk takes place. It's some like random bungalow, right?
Yeah.
It's like when that period where we were in Fort Lauderdale, it felt like we were like part of like something new was happening. And so we were like, we were chasing these legends of the past, like we were like 2600 Trap Avenue, which turned out to be the drummer Chris Cotty's house. Like when we finally did become friends with the Eat, like in the mid 90s, he still lived there, it turned out, it was just his house, but like it wasn't easy to find evidence of it anywhere, and we very much wanted to, but at that point we started like being more visible. Like I said, we were booking shows, and then we started Chickenhead. So that's kind of how we started getting into stuff. So we started going down to Churchill's in early 91. Churchill's kind of became the spot for us. I went to see a band called the Human Oddities. Um, and they played with the methadone actors. And so this was kind of when we first started kind of making friends with some bands down there. Because I really enjoyed the Human Oddities set when I saw them. They were doing a pretty like punk rock. Like they were not a hardcore metal band, they were playing a punk rock kind of set with like a kind of goofiness to it. Um, and then, yeah, the Methadone Actors were also a punk band. This fellow Mario is a singer, and we became friends with Mario. He was a little bit older, and so then we were like, oh, okay, so these are some people. This is one thing, and we started working on the band Chickenhead with uh, Buddha on drums and me on guitar, and we didn't have a bass player, and we got a gig. Like there was a party at Jimmy the Brain from he was the singer of the Human Oddities. I think him and his brother lived in South Miami, and they had a party by the pool, So it's another not exactly the Ramones brick wall kind of scenario,
Right.
And so we went to play this gig in the middle of 91, and at this point we felt, we were really feeling like we were like connecting with people. We were, because we had brought down a bunch of bands. Get Loose and Scam were being read in the rest of the country a lot, like not so much in South Florida, but like we were really popular in other places. So we were like trying to spread the word, like, hey, everybody come visit us. And people did kind of start visiting us. And then we were like, okay, we can finally do this band. And the first show was like, we only had like 4 songs, and we played, and Chuck like produced like a jar of peanut butter or something out of nowhere and like broke it on the patio and like rolled around on it or something, just did this kind of Darby Crash act. And we were like, I was completely surprised. Like I had no idea that that was coming, and it was really well received. I think we had to play our 4 songs twice. And so I was like, whoa, this is a turning point. We're like in a real band, we just did a thing. People liked it, it's kind of a big deal. And I think like for Chuck and I, like we never really formally discussed the conceptual project, but I think we both had a sense that Chickenhead's role was like, um, we were trying to like it didn't matter so much like what our songs were. Like we did end up like working hard to make a 7-inch that we thought the songs were pretty cool, and they're like well played, and like we could do that, but like it was more like we were trying to like in the context of this, like we were kind of in a cultural battle with this like violent punk scene, and also we were kind of in a cultural battle with like major label punk, because Nirvana broke really big in 1991, and all of a sudden there were like all these like bands that were kind of more in it to make it, and we were kind of more, we had this vision of punk being more pure and being this underground thing and this DIY kind of thing. And so we felt like in that context, our band was kind of going into these shows and kind of like imploding the space. Like it was impossible for people to violently dance to our band. We sort of actually turned the violence inward and created this spectacle where we were like hurting ourselves, we were like, and it was so ridiculous that like, it like freaked people out, but it also made people laugh.
Was
Um,
that planned or was that by accident?
well, that's what I'm saying is I think that we didn't like formulate it like in advance as like this is the idea, but once we saw how it went over, I think we really understood like, okay, our role is to kind of like clear out some of this crap, and make a different kind of space where it's possible for people to get out of this like reflexive, like you go to the show and you dance hard and punch people. That's what it's about. And we wanted to be in a show where we wanted to be in a scene where people like had more fun, weren't afraid. After the show, we would go to Denny's and draw comics all night and drink coffee. It's like it was a little bit more of like centered on like making stuff, and we'd go out and dumpster dive or we'd go pool hopping or whatever. It's like we were making like stickers that were like anti-war stickers for the first Gulf War. In Fort Lauderdale, we did like a short-lived kind of like proto kind of food not bombs thing where we were getting food and feeding it to homeless people at the downtown library. Um, so our vision of like what punk rock could be was based more on these like admittedly like primitive and not super adequate political ideas. Um, but that's like where we were at, whereas punk for us had become this really formulaic thing of like people just show up and like fight in these kind of like corporate spaces, these like shitty rock clubs, and somebody somewhere gets a ton of money, but and it costs too much, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of where we were at, and kind of what felt like the point of Chickenhead was. And so over the couple of years that we were doing that band, like the lineup kind of revolved a lot. It was always me and Chuck. It was always supposed to be Buddha, but he went back to New Jersey where his mom moved for a while. And so we were always kind of waiting for Buddha to come back. Like, when's Buddha gonna come back? But he did write all the songs with us that were on the record and went on our tours with us. He was in the band that more people saw probably. But there was a long period of time where we were just getting revolving members. Eventually, we settled on this kid, Scott, who had been growing up in the kind of like there had been kind of like a Miami straight edge scene. And some of those kids ended up becoming more friends of our scene and less of the violent scene. Like, and Scott was one of them, and he became a drummer for our bands.
Wasn't he in Powerhouse?
He was in Powerhouse, Scott Crackrock, and Doug the Slug from Crypto. We reunited with Doug the Slug, and we got him to join Chickenhead for a while. But then we kicked him out actually because we thought he watched too much TV. We were kind of assholes actually, me and Chuck. We decided that there was a period where we're like, let's just play with guitar and vocals and no rhythm section because no one really meets our standards. I feel like looking back, like I don't know, for listeners who might have read Roberto Bolaño's novel, The Savage Detectives, in some ways I feel a little bit like an affinity with Arturo Bolano and Ulises Lima character as me and Chuck, like these kind of like super romantic assholes who were trying very hard to like live up to this like extremely pure like vision of what the avant-garde should be and like really taking it out on other people. I came back to do a reading in Miami like around 2010, and this guy Tom, who had been in a band called Smoke Dog, who had also booked shows in our time, was writing for the Herald, and he like did a little write-up about my reading that was basically like it was pretty sour. He like was kind of like those guys were dicks. Like he was right, whatever. Tom was trying, Tom was at the time was like trying to book like larger bands. Like he was also trying to like support the scene, right? And he was trying to bring like, larger, like I think he might have booked like a L7 show or something. Like from this vantage point, I'm like L7 are rad, At that time, I was like L7 are the corporate enemy, like, and so we gave people like Tom shit for not really like, you know, for not really like, supporting the true underground. But so I don't know, but I do feel like two ways about it looking back. I feel like on the one hand, um, we were upset about how all of these new people had come into the scene who didn't have this kind of like community background. And so we were really wary about the culture being becoming a corporate profit machine, in the post-Nirvana era. But actually, what in hindsight, what I saw after the 90s happened was that was actually just like Nirvana, like really did bring in a million new punks. And a lot of those kids became really cool punks in DIY situations. It really did open a lot of minds at a time when that needed to happen. And like we had nothing to fear. Like it was fine. Like there's plenty of culture. There was no scarcity. It was great. But on the other hand, some of the things that we were fighting for about DIY and the corporate culture and stuff, I think are still very relevant. Like if you're, bands in Miami today, the landscape, it's almost like punk never happened. It's really bad down there right now. It's like all the venues, they're pay to play. The rooms cost a shit ton of money. There's not a lot of situations where people can do stuff with like a lot of artistic freedom that doesn't because everything's too expensive in order to participate. And those are the conditions we were facing in the beginning. And so we were lucky to have Churchill's, which was a place where literally anything could happen. Like you could be like a 12-year-old and like bring your own six-pack in the bar, it was like absolutely anything could happen at Churchill's. And like that was so valuable. And then there was like nowhere else for us to play. Um, and so we kind of like came up with this idea to do generator shows. We like got a generator and would go way out into the edge of like, Chrome Avenue or something, like way out in the Everglades, to empty lots or like Deep Kendall. We would find places after Hurricane Andrew. There were a bunch of warehouses that had been like partially destroyed way out in Southwest Dade. We would go out and do shows in those warehouses. Um, and we did that kind of thing just in order to have a place to play, because the control was really great. Like all of the venues were like you had to send a demo and you had to be like a lot more radio friendly. Um, and there just wasn't even in that first little time after Nirvana broke, at first there still wasn't space for punk locally. I remember Chickenhead used to like we would like we would bands that were like getting successful locally, like Quit, like bands that were like more melodic or college rock. We would like get their tape and we would send it to like venues as like and say it was our demo, so we could try to like see if we could fool some club into booking us, so then we could go and like dive around roll around working class.
Did you ever get anyone to book you because of that?
No. No, it never worked. We were always trying to get into this horrible place in Fort Lauderdale called Squeeze that we thought would be the funniest place to fuck with, but it never happened.
Did you ever see any shows at Squeeze?
I did not. No, I didn't. Yeah, it was not what we were doing. But so that was the Chickenhead vibe. And that started like happening a lot in 91.
What did you like about the recording process when you actually recorded the 7-inch?
I don't remember it that well. I think we went to a place in Pompano and like I don't remember how we arrived at the decision to go there other than it was a place we could afford. Like I remember that it was like, you know, it felt like a miracle that we did it and it came out good, you know, in some ways. Like the recording process felt intimidating, but in those days too, it was similar. Like, yeah, like if you went to a club and there was a sound man, or if you like got into a studio, those people would be adversarial to a punk band. Like the sound guy would like resent having to like work to record such awful music, you know? Um, and so, or they would start telling you, like, you know, just like, you guys got to hang it up. Just say, you know, like, just like, shut up and record the record, you know, what the hell, we're giving you money.
Right.
Uh, so we found somebody who was pretty neutral and just let us do our thing, and we did it. And I thought it was cool, but I honestly don't even remember. It's probably written on the record where it happened. Um, but yeah, that year 91 was really significant for me, because Scam came out on July 6th, which is the day that we had booked Filth from the Bay Area, at the Junkyard. And so we had this, like, that was a band that we loved. They were like these super punks from the Bay. And so we had like, you know, some like heroes of ours come to town. The magazine came out and like it was well received and that was going well. And then we like started started playing at Churchill's enough to where we were able to like actually meet all these other people. And what kind of started happening was that um we went to see a band that was billed as Ghost of the Trash Monkeys, is what Dave Daniels would always put when he like let somebody from that scene book a show. He would, if it was like Bill Orcutt or George Kelly or Marky Awesome, one of those guys, he would bill it as Ghost of the Trash Monkeys, which was their band. And it was the Stun Guns. They had just started playing. And the Stun Guns were there. We had a link with them because there was a young person named Andrew Powell who had also been in Powerhouse, and Andrew had come out of that straight edge scene with Scott and some of the kids that we were friends with, like Emil Bussey, who ended up putting out our Chickenhead record. But Andrew's older brother Tim was also in punk rock. Tim Powell had been friends with George and Bill and Marky and those guys, and had been like a contemporary of theirs in the earlier punk scene. The people that saw Black Flag at Fireman's Hall. Um, and so they got Andrew to play with the Trash Monkeys, even though he was like, he started playing with them when he was like 14 or something, and those guys were like 24, you know, a little older. Um, and so we kind of made a connection with that original punk scene. And those guys started coming kind of back into circulation a little bit. And what it turned out was really that those guys had also been really turned off by the way that things had gone into this really metal, hardcore kind of violent direction. They had all been, you know, like Paul Enema from the Stun Guns, who was the singer, guitar player, had been in the band Lethal Yellow, and Marky Awesome had been in Broken Talent, and George had been in the Trash Monkeys, and so those guys like were still doing their thing quietly sometimes at Churchill's, but then we showed up with the younger punk scene, and there was this kind of like, you know, recognition across time of like, oh, you guys are like what we're into. And they, you know, they were all like 24 and we were like 18, which felt like an enormous age gap. But then we kind of put together a scene out of those different groups of people, and it became like a really cool scene, you know. So that was like where in that time is also where I started hanging out with Robert and Priya. They were still playing as Prom Sluts, um, but then they had, in 91, sometime in that year, they switched over to the name Kreamy Lectric Santa, though the bands were kind of indistinguishable. They had Tim Vaughn on drums in both bands. Tim was a really, really fantastic drummer. Um, and then Andrew Powell started playing bass with them too, eventually. But first they had this guy, Rob, the Barbarian, and that band, yeah, like, so like, you know, Robert and Priya were like older and had been around a while, and they were like in the scene with like a lot of like local artists and art people. Um, and so that felt really exciting for us, is like we got into a scene with all kinds of like creative people that were like just like really fun to be around, and it really expanded everything for us as younger people to be around them and to get some of that. Like Robert was always trying to turn me on to like cool old music and stuff. Um, and so that was like a big change for our scene in 91, is when it felt like things started really happening for us around Churchill's. I remember I met Robert and he told me where he lived, and I went to the Coconut Grove and knocked on their door and they weren't home, and I left a note. I was just like, hey, I'm gonna go panhandle at the like at the Easy Quick. And then he came up a little while later and I had got enough for a 12 pack, and he bought it because he was older. And we went back to his place, and he's like showed me, he's like actually had the Blink Generation record. I was like, oh my God, it's the actual record. And so like I started spending a lot of time with them, which was really great, because I was squatting, I was living in abandoned buildings, and there would be periods where like I would get kicked out of somewhere and I wouldn't have anywhere to go, and I could go stay with Robert and Priya. They were
Did you ever get arrested back then when you were squatting in some of those vacant places?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, there was some things. Nothing too serious happened. But one time, me and Buddha went to open a squat on Northwest 7th Avenue in a warehouse, and we got rolled on by some cops, and I ended up at the Dade County Stockade for 20 days. Yeah, it was annoying. Um, I later found it was because I didn't have an address. Like if I had given them an address, they would have just given me a court date. Instead, I was there for 3 weeks, and then the charges got dropped. Um, I was in there with Buddha, which was unfortunate for him. He got out a little earlier than me. I remember we were playing like a card game where you keep the points, like gin rummy or something, and I was like, why don't we just keep the points the whole time? But I was like, a couple weeks in, I was like killing him in this card game. And I'd be like, let's play cards. He'd be like, oh God, no. So these guys taught me how to make wine out of the bread and fruit they were serving us. And then when the charges got dropped, I passed around my jar. We all like drank a little wine, the wine which was suspiciously similar to the wine recipe in Scam for a wine that we called Ole Chickenhead. um, which is like almost exactly this thing I made with like orange juice and bread crusts in jail.
That is definitely I think the recipe's in the zine, right? It's in that
Yeah.
it is. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Unfortunately, some kids in the country did write me and tell me that they had tried to make it. Like it didn't go well for anybody.
I can't imagine it could.
No, it was Chuck's idea. I thought it was like, that's a great idea. He might have been trolling me. He might have been like, here's the recipe for wine, put it in your magazine.
Well, it definitely was nice that that this really nice book came out that has in there what the first four issues of Scam magazine.
A
So
lot of Miami in there, yeah, for
a-
sure.
absolutely. And in the book you talk about that a lot of the stuff was lost or stolen or was couldn't be recovered for whatever reason, and there was a lot that was, especially that period in Miami. So when you were putting this together, how many years after you originally wrote the first four issues did the collection come out?
I think it came out in 2010. Yeah. So the last of the first four would have been 2000. Yeah. Which is more of a San Francisco issue, but the first three are very South Florida centric.
So while you're doing all the things you were doing music wise and you were squatting in different places and what have you, going to shows, where were you finding the time to also write as much as you were?
Well, that's the thing is I had lots of time because I had figured out how to live without a job, you know? So like mo like my that was the whole point of Scam really was just that like was like not so much like you should do the things that I do, but it was more like just like kind of a spirit of like trying to figure out how to like take your time back, you know, so that you were like, you know, there as much as you could that you were doing things for yourself, you know? That was the motivation of it. And so yeah, I mean like our days were pretty wide open, you know, in the the early 90s, like living in squats with Ivy and you know, we'd like go downtown and like drink Robitussin and listen to Flipper on the tape players at the library and then, you know, go run around and do stuff. There was a guy named Steve Funyuns who was in the Kreamy Lectric Santa Entourage. He used to play, he made these really wonderful, kind of bitter, super catchy pop songs that he would play on the streets. This was his main thing. And he started the band with Betty Bulldozer, who had been the last drummer of Human Oddities, but who's still playing, you know, was in Floor and is like such a wonderful heavy drummer. She was playing with Steve on the streets, and then I used to play with Robert a lot. I mean, with Steve a lot on the streets too. So that was something, you know, we just like grab his little battery powered amp and some like stuff to beat on, and we'd go down to Government Center and play music or ride the Metro Mover around and play music on the Metro Mover. I remember Steve would always be like, he's like, you know, he's a very kind person. He's very polite too. And he would be like, does anyone mind if we play a song? And sometimes people would be like, I mind. And then we just like wouldn't play. We just like ride around in the Metro Mover. But yeah, there was just like, you know, it was like I was really interested in Miami. Um, I loved Miami quite a bit at that time. I would spend a lot of time biking around and exploring. A lot of things were more wide open then. Unfortunately, the city has become very controlled and policed and expensive. Um, the vibe used to be more like old Cuban guys like sitting around drinking coffee in empty lots and like watching chickens walk around and stuff. It was very laid back, you know, it was like you could kind of do anything. Um, you know, go hop in hotel swimming pools and then walk around in the halls and find food from room service to eat and you know, sneak onto rooftops and look out over the city and yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. How
Feel
was
a bit.
how was the zine getting distributed at that time?
I was had all kinds of copy scams. So I was always like doing the copying for free. Um and then a lot of it was mail order. There was Blacklist mail order in the Bay Area was selling it. I didn't do Tower Records because I felt like Tower was too corporate. Unlike Aaron Comet Bus at the time, I was like, I can't do that. Aaron was my friend, but I was like, yeah, Tower seems too much. In hindsight, I probably should have done that. Who cares, you know? But like, um, because that was the way people were getting a lot of cool culture at that time. But and you know, I was like, I would hop freight trains and hitchhike around the country and go to like a town, go to the Kinko's, steal like a big pile of zines, go to the show and get the zines to people and meet people that way. So like for a couple of years after I left South Florida, I did a lot of like traveling around the country like that just to like see things, and that's how the magazine was getting out. Um,
How did you decide you were gonna start to hop aboard a train like that and just jump trains to get to where you wanted to go? Like, did you just decide just to do it one day, or was it something you really planned out?
you know, I think it was just one of those things like um I think in the early 90s there were a lot of subcultural things that have become much more known that were like really fascinating living in such a kind of like a place like South Florida where on the surface everything is so placid. I was really fascinated like for instance, I really longed to be a part of like a political protest movement, like the kind that you read about had students had been involved in the late 60s, you know? Like I was really excited to know about the anti-Vietnam War era protests and the social movements that came for that time. And I really wanted to be in kind of that kind of oppositional culture. When the first Gulf War started, I had just been kicked out of my mom's house, and I approached an editor at the school newspaper at FAU, actually at Florida Atlantic University, even though I wasn't in any school. And I was like, "Can I write for you?" And they paid me $8 an article to write op-eds. And I wrote op-eds against this war for several weeks until they were like, "Okay, you can't write for it anymore," because that's not the vibe. We're actually kind of all in favor of this war, you know. And so I was really shocked that that didn't happen. You know, I was shocked that the country accepted that war and we didn't have a massive protest movement. But that's what I wanted. And similarly, like I knew about things like freight hopping. I knew about things like the graffiti culture of like New York City in the late 70s, you know, like things that just seemed like these really exciting underground cultures. And I would like go to the University of Miami library and try to like find a book about any of these things. There would be like one book about freight hopping, you know, that it was just like there was nothing out there yet. Um, and so I was just trying to figure out how to find ways to get these kind of kicks, you know, that were like outside of what was on the menu. What happened with the freight hopping stuff was that when Ivy was in the Bay Area, there were more kids out there who actually already were doing it. And so she connected with them and rode some trains and learned more about it. And then through fanzines, I became friends with Greta Snyder, who was the editor of she's an experimental filmmaker of some note, but she at the time was also the fanzine editor of a really excellent classic zine called Mudflap. And Greta had ridden trains and written about it. And she sent me some information on where freight yards were and where crew changes happen. And so Ivy and I actually made a decision. Ivy was away in the Bay Area um, in the beginning of 1993 and wanted to come back to Florida. And I agreed to meet her in Atlanta. There was going to be a Screeching Weasel Pink Lincoln show in Atlanta. And she was gonna hop trains across the country to get back to Florida. So I was like, okay, I'll like hop my first trains and I'll go up there and I'll meet you in Atlanta. And so we, you know, that's when I like hopped my first train was based on this information I got from Greta. Like I hitchhiked to Lakeland, Florida, and hopped a train up to Jacksonville, you know, and that's how it all kind of started for me.
Did you ever have any real scary or terrifying moments when you were freight hopping or you were hitchhiking?
Mm, not so bad, you know, like hitchhiking, I like it's something I'm sad about in a way because I used to really like hitchhiking. I prided myself on I had an ability to make common ground with like the sketchiest stranger. You know, like I was always felt like I could like find something to talk about that would neutralize their craziness and then we could just like leave feeling good, you know? And it gave me a basically like a feeling that humans were basically good or something. And I feel like maybe that is true to this day. I'm not sure, but I feel like the United States is in such a sickness right now that people are so have been so infected with like a sense of like everyone else is the enemy um that I I'm not sure what it would be like to hitchhike now, especially as a transgender person. I just feel like, wow, it's just like now there's just too many strikes against you. It's like people are have all these opinions about you before you even start. And so things feel a lot more dangerous, unfortunately. It makes me sad to like not have access to that sense of like general goodwill, you know, that the world is basically full because it felt like at that time there was like I had a lot of confidence because I had the ability to get resources in some way no matter where I was as like a petty criminal and as like a street smart person and because I was not super worried about like I felt like I had assessed the risk of most situations and felt like things were pretty doable. So I felt like there was a lot of confidence in my ability to just I could just like at any moment just walk to the highway and leave. And I knew punks all over the country. Someone would let me sleep on their floor in any city, you know, et cetera. There was like a really nice feeling of freedom and possibility in that.
After you were finished, kind of, or even prior to the freight hopping, kind of going back to your time in Florida, there was, I imagine, a lot going on at this time. Plus, also a bit of the changing of the guard because you had the late 80s into the 90s. So, kind of going into your own personal experience, what other venues or other bands do you remember really becoming aware of, or you were just a fan yourself at that time?
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I said, 91 felt like such a period of change. Like that's when we started meeting all the people. So it was like, yeah, as I mentioned, Kreamy Lectric Santa were a big deal. The stun guns we loved. Like they were like really explosive, really catchy, like melodic punk band in a kind of Husker Du vein. Um, and like, it's like Chuck was like doing his magazine too. He wrote about a lot more local stuff at first. So like I feel like Chuck was like someone who tried to like create a mythology for all these bands. So like we were really obsessed with like Marky Awesome had written one song on the Stun Guns called like Rock Slinger. It was like it's kind of like Johnny Thunder's kind of like rock song, you know? And we were just kind of like really like just like really like championed that, like, this like Marky Awesome guitar hero, rock slinger vibe. We're like, that's so cool, you know. I saw Mark a couple years ago in Philly. It was cool. He was still doing music there. But so yeah, and then the Trash Monkeys did sometimes play, besides being the ghost of the Trash Monkeys, they were around, which was cool. They had a singer named Lloyd who was like a really great front person. He was this African American gay man who was like very sort of flamboyant on stage, but also did things like would maybe tie up like a crazy pit bull like on a very short leash on the stage. I was like flipping out, you know. And that, all of their songs were like sort of like they were like theme songs to imaginary TV shows. They had a song called Magic Dog. They had a song called Clairvoyant Housewife, and it was like, it was kind of like it sounded like the theme song to this show, Clairvoyant Housewife. Um, so they were really good. But at that time, Bill also started doing Harry Pussy with his wife at the time, Adris. Um, Harry Pussy was wonderful. Like that band was really was they were very much, I think, in some ways, like I felt like an affinity with them in Chickenhead because they also created this same kind of like musical vacuum. But they actually, though their songs were so frantic and noisy, I know that they actually practiced a great deal. Like the songs were actually very intentional. I know this because later I was in a band called the Hidden Resentments that was like where I was singing and playing guitar. Scott Crackrock was on drums, and um, it was very difficult for me to sing and play guitar. We had to practice a lot, and we're trying to do these like songs really precisely. And I remember like a lot of times we'd be at the pay by the hour space, and like Harry Pussy would be in the next room practicing, and you could hear them, and I felt like, God, they're just such making a mockery of what we're doing. Like, why am I even doing this? Like, they're just like so in this other world. They're creating this other universe, and I'm doing this like dumb thing, you know? Um,
What
but
were
they
they like live for you? Like, did you see Harry Pussy live?
Yeah, they were so great because Idris was so powerful. Like, and I think it's worth noting too, it's like Miami was like our scene had more women in it. Like the other kind of like old tough guy scene only had women in it in a like supporting role as like girlfriend or something. There were more women in our scene. It was not like a feminist utopia, but like there were some really powerful women in the scene and they really stood out. Like Priya, who is such a force when she sings, right? Like she's this talented violin player, but also she has such a powerful voice and stage presence. Um, and there were always women backup singers with Kreamy Lectric Santa. But Adris on drums and singing at the same time was like it was like this tornado, of like it just like you couldn't not look at it. It was so compelling how powerful it felt to see it. She was just like such a force, Betty Bulldozer was that way too. She's such an intense drummer, just like such a heavy, wonderful drummer. Um, and so yeah, they were doing their thing, Harry Pussy. I remember I found a flyer. This is actually, I think, funny. Like, we did a generator show in like Miramar, you know. I mean, but like way out, like under like I wonder where it was even. It was like on the way to like where's that place where Dan Marino lives? Weston.
Weston, yeah.
Yeah, it's like it was so far in the middle of nowhere. Chuck just like spotted some like gravel pit and was like, let's do a show there. Or someone else did, maybe Chuck's partner Kathleen at the time did. And so I remember we did a show out there that I saw the flyer. It was like Chickenhead and Harry Pussy and Cavity playing in this like basically like what looked like a moonscape, you know, just like this barren field of like gravel like in the middle of nowhere under like an insane like sun, you know, South Florida. And I'm like, this is like two bands that don't even have music really, like by conventional standards. Like Chuck's like rolling around on gravel, Adris is like, you know? And then Cavity plays like you know, Chuck used to say they were bringing back the 2 RPM format, you know, there's like really slow, grindy, loud, chaotic feedback.
Did you like a band like Cavity?
I loved Cavity. I thought Cavity was so good. Actually wrote about them in the New Times. I did like my first kind of piece that I wrote for the Miami New Times was about Cavity. I thought they were like such a great update on like the blues. Like their sound was this like pain of life, Miami, you know, just like you could really feel like the headless chickens of Hialeah, like crossroads, like rotting in the sun. You know, it was like really just yeah, it was so good. So just thinking about like what it would be like for someone who got a flyer for like that says punk show and went to see Harry Pussy and Chickenhead at this like gravel pit at the edge of the world. You know, it's like such a bizarre thing, and that's what we were doing.
Were there a lot of people coming out for those kinds of generator shows?
Yeah, for sure. They were really popular. You know, we would get the whole crew out there. There'd be like, you know, 50 people or whatever. It was a small scene, but a lot of people would come. Funny thing is that like somebody would always say there would always be some young spiky punk who would like there would always be like an abandoned piece of furniture, you know, like a couch, and then somebody would always set it on fire, and then there would be this billowing column of like black toxic smoke, and then like firefighters would come, you know, it was like this whole thing. Um, but like yeah, or like I remember like cruising through like on the 4th of July of 92, we did a show with I think Method Actors, and maybe Mario had also joined the Funyuns, so maybe it was the Funyuns. I remember Mario being there because he had a little gun for some reason and he wanted to shoot this gun on the 4th of July. Um, and I remember like we got like busted at one spot, but then somebody else was like, "Oh, I know of this other like, you know, empty lot in the middle of nowhere, like, you know, 80 blocks away." And so we like caravan to this other spot and like all walked through this like swamp for hours, like carrying like guitars and shit. Got to this place, to the show. So it's like that. But yeah, there were a lot of like, but to get back to bands, yeah. So I also remember, yeah, at that time Bill was Orcutt was the manager or something. Maybe he was a projectionist at the Alliance Theater, which was kind of the cool experimental film spot in town on Lincoln Road in Miami Beach. And there were some filmmakers there, like Mark Boswell was working there too, who was cool, and Steve Funyuns worked there. And I was trying to book shows that were not just like music. I got really into like doing punk art shows and punk experimental film screenings and anything that could be DIY that was also just like not exclusively music. And I started like I remember what I remember about Bill at that time was that he helped facilitate loaning the video projector from the Alliance to me. You know, he knew I was like uh, a criminal who lived in abandoned buildings who was blacked out drunk most of the time back in those days. And back when a video projector cost like quite a bit of money. And so I look back fondly on that time, thinking that was really nice of Bill to like blow me the projector so I could do those shows. Um, let's see who else was around. There was a band called Start that was around for a minute. They also had this rad girl in the band. The drummer was named Dory, and she had this wonderful exuberant playing style, and she was really great on drums. And the guy James was the main guy in the band, and their bass player Chris ended up being the bass player of the Belltones, which came a little bit later, like 95, 96. The Belltones came in, doing their really like super awesome, catchy, kind of like Stiff Little Fingers influence kind of punk rock. Um, I think what happened really was like, and and I also should say though that like Chickenhead always played with the Tri-Rails for a while, which was Ivy's band. Ivy sang with this girl Kathleen. Scott Crackrock also played drums in that band. Doug the Slug was the guitar player, and this kid Timmy Putt was the bass player. And Timmy sort of developed into this really insane bass player. And Timmy, Scott, Andrew, they were kind of a crew from that like straight edge kind of suburban Dade scene. They used to go and play acoustic guitars and acoustic bass together like nonstop, obsessively at these picnic tables in Palm Springs North, PSN, this like planned community in Northwest Dade that most people don't even know exists. They would go up there and practice all the time. And they became like really, really good. Um, and that kind of led into, yeah, the Tri-Rails. The Tri-Rails were sort of part of this like earlier day where Chickenhead and Tri-Rails were kind of like trying to clear out this space for like a funner kind of scene. Like the Tri-Rails were very goofy. They were like Chickenhead would like blow up the spot, and then the Tri-Rails would play, and they were like really fun, and the songs were kind of catchy, and you could dance to them. Um, and Timmy was often naked. He was like one of those bass players. And then that band kind of morphed into Los Canadians over time. They went to the Bay Area, Timmy and Scott and Ivy and Buddha, and played out there for a while and came back in this other form. So I think like, yeah, it's like, Chickenhead broke up. We did like our second national tour in the summer of '93. And we ended in California, and I decided to stay there. And me and Chuck both felt that like the thing that we were doing, like this kind of live act with the like breaking stuff, we felt like it was like limited. Like, we felt like if we did it much longer, it would just be kind of like we would become the thing that we were against, which was like, you know, going through the motions, like just like doing, like repeating yourself or whatever. Like we didn't want punk to be about repeating yourself. So we felt like the band was running its course. Like there wasn't much more we could do with it, but it had kind of done its thing. Like the scene really had changed.
I
Um,
think after Chuck set himself on fire at Churchill, I don't know how much further you can go than that.
right. See, that was like one of those moments. Like it seemed like a dark moment. Like we kicked Doug out of the band because he watched too much TV. Buddha never came back from New Jersey. We were like, and then we kind of like went inward and we're like, Scott, we don't want you to play with us tonight. Me and Chuck are the band. We're just gonna do this thing. And I played, I just played guitar, and Chuck like set himself on fire. And
Did you know that was going to happen, or was that all unplanned?
I sort of heard a rumor about it from his partner Kathleen, because they lived up in Boca, and that was a crazy thing. It's like I had moved to Miami to squat, and Kathleen's like father was in real estate and got them a deal on some house in Boca. So they moved to like the place I had been trying to escape. And so I was up in Boca at their house all the time. Um, they had a pool, and Chuck like I guess had been practicing all weekend, setting himself on fire and then jumping into the pool.
That is definitely some. See, when I had Chuck on the podcast, he never mentioned anything about practice.
Yeah,
So
see, I'm sorry to blow the spot. I mean, it just happened that for a minute there at Churchill's, they had been talking about videotaping bands. Mostly there was never even a sound person there. And so I think what happened, Steve Funyuns just like saw the video camera before we went on and just turned it on. Like no one knew what was going to happen. It's a total fluke of random accident of history that there's video of that performance. Like it wasn't like today where everybody had the phone, and it wouldn't have been like us to, like, probably if we had known, we would have broken the video camera. We would have been like, no, you shouldn't record anything. Like, that's impure. So like, you know right, so it's like that is definitely, like, you could say that that is like the image that captures the sort of implosion of the scene we were looking for. I went to California after summer of '93, and the band wasn't playing anymore. I was not sure where I was going to end up. In that period, Chuck started a new band called the Crumbs. And the Crumbs were much more like they played their songs. They had Ramones kind of catchy songs. They were fast paced. Chuck was the drummer. And and then in that period, they started a venue that was influenced by Gilman Street from California. And they called it Garageland. It was a warehouse somewhere in Fort Lauderdale. I'm not sure where because I never saw it. It was around for like a year while I was away. But I remember thinking when they were telling me about, I was like, everybody was sending me updates on what was going on in Florida. And I remember feeling like, oh, cool. Like, so we did it. Like now there's a space. And like there was this whole other kind of culture happening. It wasn't necessary for there to be Chickenhead anymore. Actually, what we needed was the Crumbs. We needed bands that people could dance to and have fun because there were people around that were ready to like not punch each other at shows. You'd go and have fun. Um, and so, and then by that time, a lot of the like cultural explosion of punk and indie from post Nirvana um, was starting to like have an effect. So there were a lot of new kids that were excited to participate, and the vibe really changed. And so a lot of that, like, I mean, again, I feel like, I don't want to like be triumphalist about it because I also like I miss that like weird Republic of the Cameo, like however fucked up it was, like all those people were part, like they were punks, they were real punks when punk was new. And even those guys in Boca who treated us poorly, they were like some of the original punks, and in a shitty place. And they were not using it as a stepping stone. And some of them did go to prison, and that's how it was. Um, and so I don't want to romanticize them too much, but I do appreciate that world too. But it was much nicer to participate in the garage land world. Um, and then in Miami, I came back in '95 through like '97. And those years were like a lot more fun. Like honestly, there was a lot of good stuff happening. A venue called Cheers opened on Southwest 17th, right by the Metro Rail tracks in US 1. Cheers was a little bit more polished than Churchill's, but we did have a certain amount of freedom there. Like the owner did let us kind of get away with a lot, so it didn't have that oppressive like vibe. And there were tons of young people, like just like a ton of teenagers that started going to those shows. I remember, I don't know if you know Christy Rhodes. She's an illustrator and a writer and a tarot card reader who lives in Brooklyn. She's from that Cheers scene in Miami. She's like is somebody that we knew as when she was kind of a child at that time. Um, and so like we started having more solid places, and like that we had some control over what we did inside of and where we could like get paid and like act however we wanted. And so the scene really got thick for a while. There were a lot of great bands. And
were there a lot of bands because of this time period in the mid '90s? Were there other bands you were discovering that were from Florida that may have been coming further north in the state or other parts of the state?
Yeah, I mean, there were some bands we liked from the rest of Florida. I mean, earlier on, I had had a friendship with Chris Sparrows from the Pink Lincolns. He's more from the older days, though. Chris is like Chris has a lot of photo credits in the Get in the Van book, Henry's book, because he was like the punk from Tampa in the 80s. Like everybody knew him. Like Billy Stevenson and those guys would go stay with him on tour and stuff. Um, but then like I remember the like punks from the Bay Area used to visit us. There was this guy Aaron Comabus who did a zine called Comabus. Aaron came down for on a trip in '91, and he was raving about Radon from Gainesville. He was like, "This is the best band in the country." So that's kind of the first I heard of them. Radon were like some guys from Miami actually that had gone to school in Gainesville. That was a thing. I don't want to, get into it too much. I always felt like we didn't quite connect with Gainesville. Like Gainesville had a lot of like smugness about, that it thought it was like the place, but mostly the people were from Miami and they like would go to school in Gainesville and talk shit about us. Um,
Was that
but
when you were also playing shows up there with Chickenhead?
yeah, we went up a couple of times and played this place called the no, we didn't play the Hardback. We played Club Velvet in downtown, and Chris Barras from the Pink Lincolns brought this guy with him from Tampa area. I think his name was Dave, and Dave videotaped both of those shows. Those shows were kind of like they definitely contributed to the Florida legend of Chickenhead because we like went up there and there was a place in Gainesville where it was really easy to buy white crosses, like those kind of like amphetamine pills. So I'd always pick those up when we were up there, and we would just do a bunch of pills and cough syrup and go nuts. And so, but it was Tri-Rails and Chickenhead together. We're kind of like, this is what Miami is like, trying to bring it there. And so it's like you bring that thing to another place, and then, like 90% of the people are like, fuck you. And then some of the people are like, now we're best friends. So that was kind of what it was like. I also was hitchhiking to Tampa a lot in those years um because I just wanted to figure out what the other scenes were like. There were shows at the Star Club in Ybor City. I even booked one up there one time for Nuisance and Schlong from the Bay Area.
What did you like about Ybor?
Well, I'm not sure that I liked it that much in a way. I was trying to just figure out what was going on up there, like I like but also I felt like the Star Club did feel kind of free. It wasn't as free as Churchill's, nothing was, but it did feel pretty wide open. I I remember I met this guy who I'm still friends with, Combat Kelly up there. He'd be fun to have on here. He is now a labor organizer. He later on did a pirate radio station in Tampa of some renown that was raided by the feds in the late 90s. And he ran for city council at some point. He's kind of a local muckraking radical journalist. I remember meeting Kelly there. And I remember Joey from Blatz from the East Bay. He came down and lived with us for a while and actually played drums in Chickenhead, one of the periods where we are like, "Where's Buddha?" We're waiting for Buddha to come back. And Joey came and played with us, and then I remember, yeah, he and I hitchhiked up there because Green Day was playing, so we went up there to meet up with them and get a ride back to Miami with them. And they played at Washington Square and Miami Beach. Um, but yeah, anyway, by the mid 90s, like yeah, like the Beltones were a band that started playing a lot. Beltones I thought were really great. And AAA was a band that was playing a lot. Against All Authority, they were kind of like a more spiky punk ska mixture. Really sweet people. What sort of was interesting, I felt like by the late 90s was that like it's like our scene was small but like tight and good in South Florida. Like we liked it a lot. It was interesting though that like I felt like all of the bands that played in South Florida had these kind of really big followings outside of Florida at that time. So it's like AAA was like became this really popular like kind of like crusty patch scene kind of band. Like um they would go on tours that were really big. but in South Florida, like they're playing pretty small shows. Cavity got really big in their kind of like post-hardcore metal world. Like Pushead put out one of their records and drew a cover for them. They also would like if they could get it to a lineup together to get out of town, they would play these really big shows. People would be like really excited to see them. Um, Chickenhead, of course, had made all these connections throughout the country, including with Lookout Records. Lookout Records had asked if they could repress the Chickenhead 7-inch. It had quickly sold out when Emil Bussey put it out on the 4.5 records. Um, and but we had this thing going on where we had been stealing the postage, like soaking it in rubbing alcohol to reuse the postage, and we were only charging $1 for the record. We had this like crazy, like, again, this kind of purity vibe about like no one should have to pay for this, you know. And so when Christopher from Lookout met with me and was like, yeah, I really want to do the record, and I was like, you got to do it for $1. Here's how you can do it. You start soaking the stamps, you know. And he was like, we just can't do that, you know.
I
And I was,
think that's in Scam issue 1, maybe those instructions.
yeah, for sure. I mean, all that stuff is still viable, for whatever, the post office barely exists, but that's still there. Um, but yeah, so that, so Chickenhead didn't do that, but then the Crumbs ended up doing a couple records with Lookout. So they were like they were known in this kind of 90s pop punk scene and were doing big tours around the country. And then of course Harry Pussy was extremely popular outside of South Florida. Went on tour with Sonic Youth, and it's like, yeah, so it was interesting that I felt like we had like kind of like a band, and the Beltones got really popular outside of South Florida too. Like in their kind of like they kind of grew into this being popular in a more kind of like I don't know, I want to say like oi kind of scene or something, but like, so all these bands that were really good in South Florida that were just playing for each other in this, like, you go to a show and there's 50 people there, like were really popular outside of town, but we were playing together all the time. And I really I really enjoyed all of those bands quite a great deal at that time. I thought they were great.
And speaking of the South Florida scene at that time too, I want to also talk about your relationship with Star Crunch,
Mhm.
with Chris Lalugas and Mary as well. So, what are your memories of learning about what they were doing? How did you meet them?
Well, I knew Chris through, well, Mary was actually, I knew a little further earlier. She had been at Yesterday and Today records. She was just like the rad older punk girl that worked at the record store. It's like you're just like, oh, because it's like going to the record store was like, um, it's like I didn't have any money, but like you would go to the record store to like try to connect somehow with punk, before it was, and so you'd go there and see, you just like look at records or like see if there was any like, ads up or, whatever, is there any flyers for shows? Um, so she was like a person who was inside of this like cathedral of punk, it was like inside of the rarefied space of punk and just like, wow, you work here, that's amazing. um and then Chris, like I knew him a little bit. I just knew him because he lived with Robert and Priya. um and so like we didn't have a super prior connection, but he did step in at that point. And my history on it's spotty. I know you talked to him. I feel like what happened, right, was that like he took over the YNT store from someone else, and then he started doing Star Crunch Records. Yeah.
Right.
So he was very invested in the infrastructure, and I think that that's something too that's really important that um, people understand now has been lost, is that like, because now we depend so much on corporate platforms like social media to like tell other people about the shows, and that's where like that's where all the photos of our shows are like are like archived, and that's where, in these places that we don't own, we don't have any control over. And I think we've seen with the collapse of like independent distros, like it's had a really big effect on like the culture of making magazines, for instance. Like there's no distro anymore, so it's no one really makes them. It's like there's no way to do it. And yeah, so I think, yeah, it's like it was important to have someone like Chris who had a record store, who was like doing, who was then committed to putting out records. And yeah, what did he put out? He put out that great Loose Canadian 7 inch. He did Cavity too, right? Yeah.
Did a split with Cavity.
Yeah, he did a bunch of stuff. So he was around for a minute there. I've lost touch with him. Like after I pretty much ceased in day-to-day Florida in like summer of 97, and then didn't really start going back seriously until like 2017, you know. Um, so there was a long gap there, but those couple of years like 95, 96, and into 97 were pretty fun, thick years for the scene, I felt like. Yeah.
Was there
Yeah.
any band that from that period that later on, maybe 5, 10, 15 years later, that you discovered that maybe you just missed? You maybe you didn't know a lot about them at the time, that you went back to later, a little later on to rediscover?
Mm. No, I think we like were like obsessively, like me, Ivy, Chuck, we were all like trying to like learn about every single thing. We were trying to track people down. We would go to like like I said, like yeah, like I remember there was an ad at Open Booking Records for people looking for like a bass player, and it was like two guys named Hector, and we were like, shit, like, there's two Hectors who are punks. Like, and so we like tracked them down and like became friends with them. They ended up starting a band called Darvis Brown and the Smoke Asses that played a lot of those shows for a couple years. They were like a great fast punk band. Um, and then Hector ended up going out with or being partners with George Kelly for a couple of years, and they moved away together. Um, so yeah, it was like, yeah, we just like went and like tracked everybody down, like we did end up finding Mike O'Brien at some point. That was a huge deal for us. We are like, the guy from the E, talks to us. That's cool. And he like dubbed us copies of like all their old recordings, and like before any of that stuff got reissued. And so we were like able to like ask him lots of questions about the old days. Mike ended up, getting in a band with Buddha. Buddha, is someone you should have on. I mean, Buddha's probably played on like 60 records now. He was in Cavity, he was in Los Canadians, he was in Kreamy Lectric Santa, he was in kind of most of the bands, he was in Chickenhead, he was, etc. Um, Still plays in bands to this day. And
That the drug czars you're thinking of with Mike O'Brien?
yeah, he ended up doing the Drug Czars with Mike O'Brien and Jeff Hood out from Rich Metal. And Chris Cotty from the E also played in that band at first, and then Chuck later played on drums. And so it was like feeling that continuity with those the old timers was like really important to us. It was, and Jeff and his wife at the time, Lisa, who had been in Morbid Opera, like Morbid Opera started playing a little bit too. And then Lisa got in some bands with younger people. Also, Lisa was in a band called the Gargar Girls, with Monica and Tara in like 96, 97. Um, and so like, yeah, it started to feel really exciting that like, like we had sort of like closed the gap around like the older and younger punks, and like, and then we'd always meet some people here and there who had been exiled from that tough guy scene too, who would start coming in, yeah. And that scene sort of kind of withered off a little bit, yeah.
When you had the opportunity to, let's say, talk to someone from that prior scene, what would be a question you would ask them? Like, what would you want to know?
You mean like the late 80s scene that I came into?
Yeah, like if you were chatting with like a Mike O'Brien, for example, like what would be
Oh,
one of those questions that you had on your mind that you wanted to know from someone like that?
oh, back then, I mean, we wanted to know like, I mean, I think questions that I was always would always be interested in were often more like less about the bands even than about like than about like daily life. It'd be like, I wanted to know like, well, where did punks hang out? Like, what did you guys do? Like how did you find each other? What was it like? that kind of stuff I think is always like when I did this 10 years ago or so, I wrote about the 30th anniversary of Black Flags Damaged LP for the LA Weekly. So I did interviews with everybody in the band and a lot of people around the band, and then turned that into a larger project of writing about Black Flag. But a lot of it really was about the psychogeography of Los Angeles in the early 80s, and like where did the punks all hang out, and like what was this at a time when like there were like thousands and thousands of punks, like it was this enormous subculture that never quite broke the way that the hippie culture did. It was kind of squashed by the major labels. And so I was really fascinated about the size and scope of it at that time, and like where they just like literally were all the time, what they did. And I think that that stuff has always been really interesting to me.
Did it surprise you what you learned, or did you kind of expect the answers that you got?
I think that like it was almost like affirming. Yeah, it's like sometimes it's like kind of nice sometimes you would just be like, "Oh, it's always been hard for punks in South Florida. You guys are just like us." It's like it's too hot. You don't really go out until it's nighttime. You wear these like cutoff shorts. You don't really bother with a mohawk. It's not your thing.
Right.
Um, yeah, I think it was just nice. It was like kind of more like that. And like everybody was so friendly and inviting and stuff. I saw Jeff a couple weeks ago. It was cool. I played in Miami on my birthday and Jeff came out. It was really
Oh,
sweet.
nice.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, Jeff was a great guest on the podcast. For anyone that has not checked out that episode with Jeff Hodap, and of course, the recent Morbid Opera episode is a
Yeah,
pretty good too.
I haven't checked that out yet, but I want to hear that Morbid Opera episode. Yeah, that's
Good
great
one.
stuff.
Yep. Uh, I want to talk about radio for a minute because
Okay.
although you have your mainstream radio, there was also some other stuff that was going on. Some more college radio, some more pirate radio. Did that have any influence at all on you as you were kind of in the scene?
There was a radio show in the late 90s, I'm sorry, late 80s into early 90s. This fellow, Bob Slade, I think he had one night. It might have been Sunday nights or Monday nights.
Off the beaten path?
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah, so like we used to listen to that Bob Slade show for sure. I wouldn't say it was super like influential exactly, but it was just part of the hunger of like being like, we want to know, is there what's coming out? Um, but I but like no, I never made like I know like I went to see Jello Biafra speak at the University of Miami. I know he had been on the air earlier in the day. Like there was like the college radio, but I didn't feel like super connected to it. Um, as far as punk rock stuff goes, what was more interesting was there was just a lot of like pirate radio in Miami that had nothing to do with punk rock or like activist politics. There was all of this kind of hip hop related underground radio in Miami through the 90s. There was a very mysterious station that down at the left end of the dial that I used to tune in and out a little bit. I ended up writing about my search for this radio station because became kind of obsessed with them. I was just like uh there was a period in the late 90s where I was um in 97 I lived off 79th Street for 6 months. It was like the last place I lived in Miami before I moved away. And so up there, it was this station was really loud and clear, and you couldn't really hear it south of the river or anything. So I was like, okay, I know it's up here somewhere. And so I spent a lot of time just like riding around my bike, like wondering about this station. I wrote a piece for This American Life actually about that station. And I did sort of find them. But yeah, anyway, you could still find that online. Yeah, and so it's like yeah, my stuff ended up like I ended up selling a lot of like stuff to the University of Miami to their archive in around 2010. when they had a new librarian there who wanted to build up like a special collections around the subcultural and activist history of Miami. And I was the first acquisition. And it's like, it's like Miami is a fairly recent city in the United States. It is like Florida is a newer place in the United States. Not Florida itself, but like the form that it's in now. And so like it's in a cycle where the dominant sort of hegemonic narratives of what Miami means or what Florida means are just starting to really be challenged, and they're starting to be like an archive of the history of like, oh no, actually there's always been political people in Miami, there's always been subculture in Miami, in Florida, etc. um and there's always been people who like didn't fit into that narrative of what Florida is supposed to be. And so like from an early age, I was obsessed with that. And like then was just have been, trying to historicize as well and to like fit our culture into that narrative of like oppositional narrative, oppositional culture.
What were some things you had provided to the school? You remember what you gave them at that point when you were first starting
Yeah.
that out?
Yeah, I had like tons of flyers. Yeah, like tons of flyers, tons of demos. Um, like so there was a lot of like very specific Florida history stuff that could be useful like for people who are like interested in the kind of stuff that you're talking about here. You could go look at some old flyers, you could go hear demos. There was a lot of stuff specific to me. There was like correspondence that I had with people across the country, like my letters and papers and notebooks and stuff like that. I gave them a lot of weird ephemera, like Kinko's counters and like um, you know, probably like I don't know, like stuff that was like like a railroad spike or just stuff that was like part of the life, that like you could make an installation out of it. You could put all this stuff in a room and feel the aura of you know like maybe padlocks literally that I had cut to open squats or things like that.
Did they ever do an exhibition with some of the stuff you brought in, or maybe a couple, maybe years later?
Yeah, they do a lot of, I think a lot of the paper, not maybe with all that stuff, but the paper gets shown a lot. Like people teach it. Like that's part of the special collections is the stuff that's in the special collections. Um, they a lot of it, people like every once in a while will write me and be like, oh, I saw your stuff in the vitrine at the library or whatever. But also people will like use it as classroom teaching materials to talk about South Florida or subculture, that kind of thing. And so they have the cut and paste scam originals,
Wow.
um, including issue one, which I had to dumpster in Chuck Loose's kitchen, or I think Ivy did. Ivy was like, "Wait, these are the scam originals," and like pulled them out of the trash at Chuck's house because Chuck was like, "Tell that dirtbag to get their shit out of my house."
How important is that for you just to have that kind of legacy where that is something that is still used to this day and people are learning from what you contributed?
I think it used to be more important to me, and now I'm more in the present moment these days. Like now I'm playing like improv music, and like I'm really, I got to a place with punk rock. It's ironic because we're here, we're talking about history. It's because I like talking about Florida. Like I feel fondly towards those times, but I I do feel like 10 or 15 years ago, I started to feel like there was such a archival effort towards old punk that I worried that the dead were gonna bury the living, like as Nietzsche would have said, that like that we were gonna, especially with the way that the internet changed things. On the one hand, it's magical that we can just go find all this old music. On the other hand, when things are out of context, you lose some of the flavor, right? You lose the like sights and smells and like what it was like in the context of how these things went together. But then you also like I fear that there's a way that people start to like feel self-conscious about what they're doing now. You know, they're like, oh, I need to be more like this thing from the past in order to really be punk or whatever, you know. Um, it's another thing though, where it's like the change is made. There's nothing you can do. It's like Nirvana happened. That was a change. You know, at the time we were against it. Now I don't feel that way. It's just like the changes happen and change is the only constant. That's just what happens. So now we live in a world where you can mash up every single culture and you can instantly put together like a play mix out of like songs from like the entire world and from every culture in like moments and play them back to back and then have that be the influence for your band, you know. Um, so it's like that's just how it is. It's cool, you know, it's a different thing. Um, but I used to feel a little bit worried about how the archive was going to go, and I felt like a little bit torn about putting my stuff into the archive because, you know, what we do is secret, right? That's punk rock, you know. So it'd be like maybe it's better that this stuff disappears and people can reinvent it themselves. There is a fascinating way that as we found when we met the older punks, there is a fascinating way that things continually reinvent the same ways. You know, there's an eternal return where you like you find out that your scene has all these things in common with the each scene, but you never knew each other or met each other, and it just sort of happens that way, and it's really interesting. Um, so you know, I was kind of like, maybe it's better to let these things go and let them disappear. But in the end, I was sort of motivated by revenge because I felt like, you know, I just remember like me and Ivy like living in abandoned buildings and being like, oh, we're panhandling in front of this grocery store because we're like our parents tried to kill us and we're like 18 and we live on the street, and like the manager of the grocery store comes out and like throws a shopping cart at my head, you know, or something. You know, and I was like, well, fuck that guy. I'm part of Miami history. You know, where's the manager of Woolies today? No one knows, you know. So like that's kind of how I felt. It was a little bit
Right.
like, yeah, we got to stake a claim here actually, because otherwise it's just all like, um, otherwise it's all Joe Carollo.
What do you think is something a part of your past that is part of your compass today?
Uh, I feel like, in a joking way, I mean, I feel like my music I play now is probably pretty similar to some people's ears to Chickenhead. Because I'm playing experimental improv guitar and it's like it doesn't necessarily sound like, there's definitely no songs, you know. Um, and it is definitely motivated by a desire create to clear out a kind of space, though now it's the motivation is more about creating a space for people to feel present in their own bodies, through the sort of effort of concentration that I'm making. It kind of like there's an effort of concentration that comes from making the thing in real time that I think sometimes the audience really feels too. But I think what's present, I'm still on the search, like that search for the pirate radio station or whatever, like the little stray detail that I become obsessed with. Like I still feel that very much. Um, and some of my original core political values, like I was very interested in like things like food not bombs and squatting because they were so practical. It's like people need food, so you get food and give it to them, or you need like people need housing, so there's all this empty housing, you go take it. Like that stuff still feels very salient to me. It's like I just think that that's how things should be going. Um, and I very much support all that work. And I still, though, like I said, like I've come back to feeling like, like me and Chuck were a little bit silly about some of our purity stuff. Like I do think that, like I really believe in DIY culture. Like I've seen both sides of it. I've played like in front of 40,000 people, like at the most possibly corporate event that you could play, Um, and I still also play in living rooms sometimes, and like I think that they're both really great for different reasons. And I really love being able to I love being able to connect with younger people in an authentic way inside of a real DIY community, and to have a reciprocal relationship with people that are making culture in difficult conditions without money, and to be a part of that together. Like, it still feels really vital to me.
When do you think that happened in terms of you coming around? Because there was a period where if it was something corporate related, it was off the table. And but later on in your life, you had done
Mm.
things like that. What was that turning point for you?
I think it was like, well, in the situation I cited, for instance, it wasn't my project. I was like a hired guitar player inside of a band called Bikini Kill, and that's the way that they were doing things. And for me, it was worthwhile to have that as my job. I was employed, and so I felt like I felt interested in it, and I felt like there was enough for me in terms of like what that job was going to bring to me in terms of like learning things about myself and about life and about how to play music in different formats, that I thought was like um that made it worthwhile, that it was like important. But also similarly too, with Bikini Kill specifically, I would say that um like I know there's like for people, there was like I knew a lot of people who were friends of mine at that time who were like, oh, I don't fuck with reunions. They're like, that time and place is over, like it's nostalgia to bring this back. And I felt like um I appreciate that sentiment, but from inside of that project, I could see also the way that actually, okay, so like I don't want to like say this in a way that it's going to sound negative, but okay, so like there are these guys who are friends of mine. They're called Jawbreaker, and they got back together a couple years ago, and they were playing shows, and I went to their shows, and they I love their songs, and they're sweet people. And the shows did feel kind of like nostalgic. There were a lot of older punks there. And I felt like with the Bikini Kill situation, it felt more like there were young women coming to the shows, like, and it was during the Trump administration in a time that was a hard time for women, and it, it felt like it opened up an umbrella for everyone to come together and for women to come together in a pro-woman powerful space and see each other, which is really important. People need to like see each other before they can organize. You have to get all the people under the tent and have to have and put people in a situation where they can feel we as the pronoun, right? And I felt that that was what was happening inside of our shows at that time. I could see that it was like people were bringing their teenage daughters and stuff like that, or like a lot of younger kids were coming, and it felt more like the energy from the past was fueling something current, that had there was a continuity there. So I thought that that was special.
What was the feeling for you? Because again, you may not have been with the band perhaps in the uh, early parts of their tenure. So you coming in, what was the reaction for you that you were feeling from the audience?
Um, oh, the audiences loved it. It was very electric. I didn't feel any I felt, I mean, also probably because of the audiences were younger, I didn't think that they necessarily had like an attachment to Bill Caron, the former guitar player, so much. Who Bill is a wonderful guitar player. He's such a savage guitar player. I really feel like a lot of affinity with his sound and his style. He brought so much off-kilter energy to that band, and he's such a great player. And he is a friend of mine. And is somebody I feel a lot of fondness for. But they chose to do it without him. I was the one who was asked to do it, and for me that was like an honor to be asked and to be chosen. I feel like reaction from fans was positive. Reaction from old friends of the bands was very positive. I got a lot of like positive feedback from like people who had been close to the band for a lot of years, for sure.
Did you get to play any shows with Bikini Kill that perhaps in all the other bands you'd played in over the years that you never got to go to, but this time around you did get the chance to play somewhere you had not played before?
Oh yeah, I mean, because it was at such a different level. I mean, it's like when I saw Bikini Kill back in the day, it's like they were playing at like Gilman Street, on a tour where they were playing in basements. Um, but like we were playing like the Hollywood Palladium, and then like yeah, of course the Riot Fest gig in Chicago, we headlined that, and that was like I said, yeah, 40,000 people. So yeah, it was all new experiences for sure. I had never done anything at that level before with that for that many people. And there was kind of a circus around it in Los Angeles. I mean, when we started, it was like the mayor wanted to have a Bikini Kill day, and we thankfully the band said no to that because the mayor was trying to was not a great guy and was trying to use them in some ways, and they were like, yeah, we're not part of that, we don't want your Bikini Kill day. um it was powerful to be in a band that was like, we don't need that, but so there was a lot of like, there was such a like buzz around it for a minute that it was like, yeah, like, I would be on the streets and people would come up to me and be like, that was amazing, last night, or like in the airport or stuff like that. I had like a brief period of like, like being recognized in airports.
What was that like for you?
uh it was just cool. I was just glad that people liked it so much. It's like they were pretty nervous to get the band back together. They had quite a legacy and they wanted it to go well. And we practiced for like 5 months before the first show, like with, intensity so we were trying really hard to make sure that nothing went wrong and that we sounded really good. And so I think that everybody was stoked that we had, people felt like we delivered.
Did you make it back to Florida with Bikini Kill at all?
Yeah, I did actually. We played in two shows in Miami and one show in Orlando with them.
Did you have anyone that was still down in the South Florida area that came out to that show? Maybe not just because it was Bikini Kill, but because they know you and you were going to be
Yeah,
playing.
yeah, for sure. I had a little crew there. Yeah, I have a lot of friends from Lake Worth and Miami that came down and stuff. It was really nice.
Did your mother ever circle back around to you? Did she know what you had done, all the contributions and things you had been a part of? Did she eventually know anything that you had done like that later on?
She's hard to fathom. I mean, she's passed away now, but she was just a very, for whatever reason, I think she had her own abuse history. She was very dissociated. We attempt to have I attempted to maintain a relationship with her for years. It never got super great. Um, she knew about stuff but didn't really understand it. Like I feel like sometimes she would think I was making it up because it didn't seem like she was so not in the world. It's hard to explain, but she just didn't understand like the activism I was doing. She didn't really understand what a book tour was like. If I tried to tell her about Bikini Kill, she would be like, "Oh, mom, I played for 40,000 people," and she'd be like, "That's cool, honey," but like yeah, it just didn't seem, yeah. And then she started to lose her memory towards the end of her life, and like, I got her into some assisted living and was kind of helping her out towards the end. Yeah. So, it's bittersweet for sure.
Yeah,
So the
sure.
happy ending is that I was adopted actually by her. So sometime in the zeros, I like went on like a kind of epic search to find my birth mother. I was born in Orlando, and because I'm a person who likes to search
Yeah.
for a straight thing. And so I actually did find my birth. It's a long story, but I found my birth mother and we were reunited, and we actually have a pretty good relationship now.
Wow.
So I sort of like have my original mom, and over time we became like close. It took a while. We met as adults, but like,
Sure.
we become close.
When you had shared about your life, what was her reaction to some of the stories and the things that you had experienced?
I think she thought it was cool, you know, like she loved rock music and she was glad to know that I was a musician. Um, I think that some of the things that to me felt like adventurous or heroic, you know, like hopping freight trains around the country and figuring out how to live in abandoned buildings. I think to her that was like felt tragic. You know, she was a little bit like, oh, if I hadn't have given you up for adoption, you wouldn't have had such a hard life or something, you know. Like she like blamed herself and I was like had to be like, no, 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 it wasn't like that. You know, it was like you know like I was in a shitty home situation and like sure like I have baggage from that for my whole life that unfortunately I've spent a lot of money on therapy to deal with, but I also like it did, you know, what happened is what happened and I made a life out of it and I
Right.
was able to connect with all these wonderful people across the country and be part of this like amazing culture and like have a lot of like fun adventure that was like pretty unsanctioned. You know, like I feel
Sure.
like yeah, the amount of things I've done that are like absolutely um illegal and bizarre and unusual and like so cool to remember, like, you know, like I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, your life could have turned out totally differently. So
Exactly. Exactly. Who knows? Yeah, what kind of square I could have ended up being.
you could have grew up in Orlando instead of South Florida.
I would
But
choose the 1970s Key West.
yeah, yeah, I'd probably would take you up on that too. So, yeah, I think it's just fantastic to hear some of these stories and to learn more about the life that you had in Florida and just all the contributions that you made over the course of the time that you really were living down there and just from the zine scam to the bands like Chickenhead and all the different shows you went to. Uh, when does the book come out?
I am writing a book
You don't say.
about Florida. Yeah, I am, but I don't know when it comes out because I've been working on it in different forms for a couple years, and my partner and I have been making a movie in Florida. And so there's a lot of material about Florida from the last couple years. I was down in Miami like in 2019. We did a screening of work in progress of some of that stuff at North Miami MoCA. With Kevin Arrow was there actually, yeah, because he was working at North Miami MoCA there. So he also has a lot of great Miami history stuff. I know he just gave all his papers to the U of M too, so you could go check out his stuff. Um, but yeah, I'm just, you know, I have a lot of Florida stuff in the works. Like I'm working on it right now. We'll see how it goes.
I mean, I was partially joking, but not joking. So it's nice to hear that you actually are working on something, and I imagine it'll be pretty incredible.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean the thing I'm working on is kind of like I think it's like a memoir, a kind of experimental memoir about Florida that's like about like that kind of looks at Florida like Florida as like a colonial site, you know, like thinking about Florida as Mars, you know, as Florida as like this place that like uh a small group of settlers arrived in and were able to survive due to climate control. A place that has been heavily exoticized by settlers and sort of like thinking of myself as a transgender body inside of this uh the time of the 70s when South Florida was like growing up in the 70s and 80s when Florida was growing too, and I was watching the raw primeval jungle sort of become strip malls and gated suburbs and watching this colony sort of become, you know, become realized in real form in what had been like a Edenic paradise previously.
well, it's been great having you on, Erica. Thanks so much for taking the time to come on the podcast and to share your story and to take a trip down memory lane going through the different time traveling, both literally and figuratively, because I know you had definitely had traveled quite a bit. And again, just been a great opportunity having you on. I do kind of want to give you the last word to kind of close us out. Anything else you wanted to share to wrap up? I'm going to turn it over to you to take us home.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. Let's see. First of all, I know that there's some outro music, so I'll introduce it. I think you're going to play Never Was, which is a song. I have a new record out that I made with a fellow named Vice Cooler in Los Angeles. We made it during pandemic lockdown, where we did remote file sharing with all kinds of friends and collaborators, like Kim Gordon and Kathleen Hanna and the Raincoats and Brontes Purnell and Kelly Deal and people like that who sang on the record. But this song is with my old partner in crime and best friend and collaborator Ivy from back in the day in Miami. She sings on this song, and Mike Watt plays bass, and I play guitar, and Vice plays drums. And this song is it came to us as a Nip Drivers cover. A band from LA called the Nip Drivers played this on their 7-inch that Chuck had in like 91. And we love this song for years. And me and Ivy have played it in every band we've been in together. But turns out the song was written was from a band called Twisted Roots, which was an early LA super group with Paul Rossler from Screamers and Pat from the Germs. And so Paul Rossler wrote the song. I asked Watt, I was like, is this you know, who did the song? And Paul, played with Watt for years too in some of his solo projects. And Paul is the brother of Kira from Black Flag and Mike's ex-husband. I mean, sorry, ex-wife. And so, we was able to talk to Paul about this song, which he remembered and was like, oh, wow, y'all did a great version. So this is that, we're going to play that as the outro from the record Land Trust, which is a benefit for the Northeast Farmers of Color. It helps Indigenous and Black farmers purchase land. And so you can get that. You could find that online if you like this song, and check out that record. All the proceeds go to that. My last words for Florida would just be like, anything is possible. Right now, Florida's in a dark place. The center will not hold. The swamp is always coming back for Florida. They cannot stop it. They cannot conquer her, the spirit of Florida. She will prevail, and all those people, Ron DeSantis, they're all going to be compost in the future Florida Republic, which is going to be really wild when half the state is underwater and only a certain group of hardy people are living down there. It's going to be like, you think it's extreme now, it's going to be like wild across the political spectrum, like far left and far right in little clans living in like palm trees and pirate radio, all of it. It's going to be amazing. So just like dream of the future Florida, orient yourselves towards it, get yourself in line for it, get ready for your place in the future Republic of Florida.